Hello again, class. All right, today we're going to talk again about the Constitution, but this time we're going to specifically focus on what rights. And many, not all, but many of the rights laid out in the Constitution come through the amendments. All right, we talked about the Federalists and Anti-Federalists and how the Anti-Federalists would never agree to ratifying the Constitution unless a Bill of Rights was added. Those are why a lot of the rights that are specifically laid out in the Constitution come through the amendments. So first we're going to talk about the Bill of Rights, the first 10, but there are many more amendments in the Constitution after the Bill of Rights that also lay out our rights. So we'll go through many of those. We won't talk about every amendment because not every single amendment deals with individual rights, but we'll talk about a lot of them. All right, so first, all right, comes the First Amendment. Now, there are actually 5 different rights laid out in the First Amendment. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press. People don't really use the word press today. They call it the media, but that's what it's talking about. The right to assemble and the right to petition. All right, so let's talk about some of these a little more specifically. Freedom of religion is just what it sounds like, but there's really a couple parts to that. One, okay, yes, people are free to choose whatever religion they want to practice, but the flip side of that is the government cannot create an official religion. All right, so not only do people get to choose their own religion, the government can't create a national or an official religion. All right, so a lot of countries in the world have an official religion, but America does not. All right, so that's why, when you're at school, in the morning announcements, you don't necessarily hear prayers in school. You have moments of silence or things like that, because public schools are not allowed to have kids give any sort of particular religious prayer, because that would basically be telling them what religion to practice, and you can't do that. The second part of the First Amendment is freedom of speech. All right, and I think everybody kind of has an idea of what this is, although people very much misunderstand this. Right? So, in some extent, freedom of speech is what it sounds like. All right, the government can't keep you from speaking or saying things that the government doesn't like. But the key word in my explanation right there is the government. Okay. The First Amendment is protecting people from the government. All right. First Amendment says Congress, okay, the legislative branch, shall make no law prohibiting or abridging the freedom of speech. Okay. So it says Congress can't make a law that takes away your freedom of speech. All right. So this doesn't mean that there can't be consequences for your speech. Okay. If you post something, on social media, something controversial, and your boss doesn't like it, unless you're working for the government, your boss can fire you on that. All right. Your boss can say, "Look, I don't want to, be associated with someone who's posting these types of comments on social media," and that's fine because your boss isn't the government. Now, the government can't throw you in jail for it; they can't fine you for it, but there can be consequences for speech. Right? You see this a lot. Someone will post something very controversial or unpopular, on social media, or they'll say something in a television interview or something, and they'll lose their job. Oftentimes they'll lose their job in the media or something. And people always say, "Oh, I guess we don't have free speech in this country." Well, yes, we do. We still have free speech. It's just the free speech is protected against government action. All right? Individual companies can limit what their employees say publicly. Right? So understand that free speech is basically just protects you from government taking away your speech rights, not from your neighbors getting mad at you or your family disowning you or your boss even firing you in some circumstance. Okay. Because as we'll see as we go through these, none of these rights, okay, none of them are 100% totally and completely absolute. All right, there's limits to just about all of them. All right, freedom of press. Again, today we call that the media. Back then they called it the press. So those are just news organizations are allowed to write whatever stories they feel like writing. All right? The government doesn't get to tell them, hey, you can't report on this, or you need to report on this. The press or the media gets to choose. Now, again, there are limitations. All right, there are things that fall under national security that the media is not allowed to tell stories about. All right, they can't. In time of war, the media can't go, doesn't have a right to publish, the Army's strategic plans or battle plans or something like that. There are limits, but for the most part, the press gets to decide what news stories they do and do not publish. All right, the right to assemble, that means to get together. All right, so the government can't tell people, hey, don't have a big political meeting, don't have that big march, down Main Street or at the park or something. Now, as always, there can be limits. All right, the government can absolutely tell people, hey, you can't go shut down the highway. You can get together for a political rally, but it has to be in certain areas of the city at certain times of day. You can't disrupt traffic, things like that. So again, there are limits. And finally, the right to petition. Petition just means to formally ask for something. So citizens are allowed to request their government to do things. The government doesn't necessarily have to follow. Or you can write a letter to the president or to a congressperson or to the mayor and asking them to change some law. It doesn't mean they have to change the law you want changed, but they at least have to give you the right to send them a letter to communicate with them. Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Again, this is not absolute. Specifically, what the Second Amendment says is a well-regulated militia. All right, so the word regulated is the third word of that amendment. Being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay? So right there, the word regulate is right there in the amendment. And yes, so the right to bear arms is very heavily regulated. And I don't think anyone agrees that the Second Amendment would give people the right to own, say, a nuclear weapon or an anti-aircraft gun or something of that sort. So there's limitations. And certainly there are laws in place about wait lists and registering and that sort of thing. All right, so none of these things are absolute. 3, no courting of soldiers. That just means the government can't force you to provide housing and food for soldiers. That doesn't really come into play much. We have through tax dollars, we provide money for the military branches to build their own housing and buy their own food, that sort of thing. So the Third Amendment doesn't really affect our lives very directly today. Fourth Amendment, no unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, to me, probably the key word here is unreasonable, because the Fourth Amendment doesn't mean that the government can't search your property or can't seize property from you. The government can, it just has to be reasonable. And a lot of times how we measure reasonableness is if they have a warrant or not. All right, so you've probably seen movies or TV shows, where policemen, goes to someone's house or building and says, I want to come in. They say, well, do you have a warrant? Come back, once you have a warrant. All right, because a warrant is sort of the proof of reasonableness. Now, again, you don't always have to have a warrant. All right, for instance, if someone's driving down the street and you see a nuclear weapon sticking out of the trunk of someone's car, the police can stop that car. They have a reasonable cause to search the car at that point. And that's obviously kind of a made-up extreme example. But the point is, if the police or law enforcement has a reasonable to suspect there's a crime being involved, then they can search property, perhaps even without a warrant in many cases. But what they can't do is simply start going door to door to door, through a neighborhood and say, hey, we're going to come in and we're going to look around to see if there's any illegal stuff happening in here. The police, the government can't do that. They have to have some sort of reasonable belief that there's a crime going on before they search or seize your property. The Fifth Amendment, first of all, this is a really long amendment. All right, so I'm going to summarize it very shortly here. Fifth Amendment has a lot of different rights in it. One, it promises due process. Now that's a fancy legal term, but to try to explain that as briefly as I can, it basically just means that those are the rules the government has to follow if they want to do something bad to someone, put them in jail, take their property, something like that. There's certain rules and procedures the government has to follow usually. That's where you get things like having an attorney. They have to give you an attorney. They have to tell you what crimes you've been charged with. That's all part of due process. Next, in the Fifth Amendment, no self-incrimination. That means the government can't make you testify against yourself. Okay. All right. And that's if you've seen this on movies, the whole you have the right to remain silent. That's what that's talking about. People have the right to remain silent. The government can't make you give testimony against yourself. You can choose to. All right, if you're accused of a crime, you can say, hey, no, I want to go to court, and I want to say, I didn't do it, I wasn't there that day, I was doing this, or that, or the other. You have the right to defend yourself in court, certainly, but the government can't make you give testimony against yourself. All right, so that's why whenever someone's arrested, they're always told you have the right to remain silent. Okay, that comes from the Fifth Amendment. Or if you've ever heard someone say, I plead the Fifth, that's what they're talking about. I don't have to answer you. Okay, to the Fifth Amendment. Then the last thing I want to talk about in the Fifth Amendment is this, I didn't know, double jeopardy. Okay. Again, fancy legal term, pretty easy to understand though. The government can't charge someone with the same crime twice. So if the government charges someone, says, okay, Johnny over here robbed a bank last Monday. And they go to trial, Johnny gets arrested, goes to trial, and the jury says not guilty. We don't believe Johnny robbed the bank on Monday. The government doesn't get to try again. The government doesn't get to keep trying more and more criminal cases against Johnny until they can finally prove that he robbed the bank on Monday. Okay, the government has to get it right the first time. Which does mean that Johnny gets to stand up and say, once the jury says not guilty, that means Johnny gets to stand up and say, oh, thanks, but you know what? I did rob the bank, and there's nothing you can do about it now. All right? Again, Johnny can do that because there's no double jeopardy. He can't be charged with the exact same crime twice. Now, what Johnny can't do, at least not if he's smart, is he can't, if the jury says, okay, we don't believe Johnny robbed the bank on Monday, Johnny can't stand up and say, oh yeah, by the way, I robbed a different bank on Tuesday. Because he can then be arrested for that. All right, it doesn't mean someone can only be arrested one time. It's just they can only be charged once for the exact same crime. But if that person's alleged to have committed different crimes on different days, they can go to court for each of those. Sixth Amendment just talks about a right to a fair and speedy trial. All right, if the government arrests somebody, they can't just keep them in jail for 10 years. They eventually have to let that person have a trial in order to determine if a jury believes that person's guilty or not guilty. Seventh Amendment's right to a jury trial in a civil case. So you really kind of have two different types of cases. One is a criminal case. That's where someone's charged with a crime. Another type of case is a civil case. That's basically everything else, everything that doesn't really involve the government accusing someone of a crime. So the thing about that is when two people or two businesses are suing each other, for breaking their contract or for damaging someone's property, and people sue each other for that sort of stuff. That's a civil trial. And what the Seventh Amendment says is you get a right to a jury. All right, so those are the 12 people that basically decides who wins and who loses. The Eighth Amendment says no cruel and unusual punishment. It also talks about no excessive fines, I believe is the exact phrase they use. All right. And that's pretty straightforward. Again, there's not a lot of detail, and so what courts thought was cruel and unusual in 1800 may not be what courts consider to be cruel and unusual in 2021. But it basically just means, the government, even if someone's found guilty of a crime, the government doesn't get to torture them or do some sort of, very hard sentence. All right? So if you get, if you get a parking ticket, the government can't put you in jail for 50 years for that. All right? They may be able to, fine you $50 or $100 or something, but they can't do something that's cruel and unusual. All right? This is why the government no longer hangs people or beheads people, for crimes. Those things are considered cruel and unusual. All right, so number 9 and 10, in my mind, I kind of think about them together. They're sort of different sides of the same coin, so to speak. All right, so the 9th Amendment says that people have rights that are not listed in the Constitution. Okay? Because when the Founding Fathers were writing the Bill of Rights and drafting it, they were afraid that, well, if we start writing down what rights we have on a piece of paper, then somebody, the government or some court, is going to come along one day and say, well, it's not written down here, and so therefore you don't have that right. And they didn't want that. They wanted to understand that rights may be thought about later that weren't necessarily written down. And the 9th Amendment protects people's rights, even when they're not specifically listed in the Constitution. Okay. Like I said, a right to a lawyer. All right, that's not specifically listed. Now, again, it's kind of part of due process, but you also get it at the 9th Amendment. The right to privacy. Our people have to some extent, the right to privacy. That falls within the 9th, to some extent the 9th Amendment helps you have that. Yeah. And then the opposite of that is the 10th Amendment says, however, all right, the people may have rights that are not listed in the Constitution, but the federal government, the government does not have any powers that are not specifically listed in the Constitution. Okay? So if the government wants to do something, it has to be listed in the Constitution. Okay? So it's kind of the opposite. Remember, the Bill of Rights is to protect people and to limit government. Okay? Those are two of the principles within the Constitution. We talked about the 7 principles of the Constitution. 2 of the principles are individual rights and limited government. And the 9th and 10th Amendment work together to do those things. So the 9th says people have rights that are not listed in the Constitution. But the 10th Amendment says, but the government, the federal government, does not have powers that are not listed. Okay? So that's your Bill of Rights. All right? And all of those were added to the Constitution pretty much as soon as the government was started. All right, so I think by 1791. The Constitution was first written in 1787. It was ratified in 1788. By 1791, you already had 10 changes, 10 amendments to the Constitution. But over the next 200 years, the Constitution's been amended another 17 times for a total of 27 amendments. And people have been given lots of rights during those later amendments, too. All right, so other rights in the Constitution. These last 3 were written right after the Civil War. All right, so the 13th Amendment prohibits slavery or involuntary servitude, which basically just means forcing someone to work against their will. There is an example, an exception if someone's convicted of a crime. All right, so if people go to jail, they can be made to work in prison. Right? The Constitution does allow that. All right, but the 13th Amendment otherwise outlawed slavery. Remember, you just fought the Civil War. Lincoln had given the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all the slaves in the South. And the 13th Amendment basically changed the Constitution to forever outlaw slavery in the United States. And then it also says Congress has the power to enforce the 13th Amendment through legislation. This is very important because remember, we talked briefly about powers listed in the Constitution. And remember when we talked about the legislative branch, they can regulate commerce, issue taxes, declare war, but it's a pretty short list. And we talked about the president's powers. The part about the executive branch isn't that long. The presidents have a whole lot of powers listed. So, when Congress and President Lincoln here came up with the 13th Amendment, they wanted to make sure the government had the right to enforce it. Because there's one thing to say, okay, slavery is outlawed. But remember, we have a government of limited powers. All right, so without the proper power to enforce it, the 13th Amendment may not have meant as much. So they specifically expanded the federal government's power through the 13th Amendment to give it the right to pass whatever laws are necessary to make sure slavery doesn't come back. All right, 14th Amendment basically guarantees citizenship to everybody regardless of their race. Okay, there had been a Supreme Court decision back before the Civil War called Dred Scott, which had basically said that slaves weren't citizens of the United States. And the 14th Amendment's to change that. It says, okay, no, everyone born in the United States is a citizen. Doesn't matter what their race is. Okay, and that's why, sometimes you may have heard that people, if they're born in the U.S., even if their parents weren't citizens, if someone is born in the United States, they automatically become a citizen. That's through the 14th Amendment. Okay, and it guarantees citizenship. All right, and it does things through phrases like privileges and immunities. All right, so it basically means if a citizen has a certain privilege or whatever the privileges of being a citizen are, the states have to guarantee them. All right? Like the state of Texas can't say, well, we allow people in Texas, we allow citizens from Texas to have these privileges, but someone from Oklahoma can't, take advantage of them. No, you can't do that. It also guarantees due process. It guarantees the equal protection of the laws. And once again, the 14th Amendment gives Congress the power to enforce the amendment through legislation. All right, so some of the, I know some of you are taking, or have taken U.S. history before, in the 20th century U.S. history. And, if you remember the Civil Rights Movement and some of the key pieces of legislation in the 1960s, well, part of that, the reason the government had the authority to do that was through the 14th Amendment, that they were passing these laws to protect African-American citizenship rights. And really, and it was specifically meant to deal with Jim Crow and discriminatory laws against African-Americans, but it does, in fact, protect people of all races. And then similar to that, the 15th Amendment guarantees voting rights regardless of race. So again, African-Americans were, through the Constitution, given the right to vote through the 15th Amendment, and Congress was given the power to enforce the voting rights through legislation. Now, as it happened, again, if you've already taken, the second part of U.S. history in high school, Congress, in fact, did not really do anything to enforce these voting rights for about 100 years, but they had the power to. And so once finally in the 1960s and 70s, you started seeing like the Voting Rights Act and things like that. Okay. Now, again, the 15th Amendment says, and it was passed again about 1870, 1871, right after the Civil War. And it said you can't deny someone the right to vote based on their race. Still didn't fix the problem of women not being allowed to vote. That was going to have to wait until the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920. All right, we just here recently celebrated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And I have a typo there. It says race. I meant to change that. That needs to say gender. In your notes, put gender. The 19th Amendment guarantees voting rights regardless of gender, not race. I forgot to change that, okay? So right here, I'm highlighting it. In your notes, write the word gender, not race. Because the 19th Amendment basically gave voting rights to women. And once again, it gave Congress the power to enforce it through legislation. All right, so Congress can pass whatever laws are necessary to protect women's voting rights. All right, the 22nd Amendment outlawed the poll tax. All right. One of the ways the states, particularly in the South after the Civil War and during the Jim Crow and segregation era, tried to keep African Americans from voting was they charged people to vote. You had to pay a poll tax. And a lot of times there were basically exceptions for a lot of white people, or that white people could use, but not African Americans. And so these were very unfair laws. And so Congress eventually, again, changed the Constitution to make poll taxes illegal. All right, so now the government can't make you pay to vote. You get to vote whether you can pay for it or not. And the last one we'll talk about, and the one that will affect all of you here in the next year or two, if it hasn't already, the 26th Amendment guaranteed voting rights to people 18 and above. All right, so before the 26th Amendment, different states had different age requirements for voting. But once the 26th Amendment was passed, which I believe it was ratified in 1971, somewhere around there, it basically made it legal once you turn 18, everyone has the right to vote. Okay, and so now by the time you get to 1971, the 26th Amendment, anybody 18 and above, regardless of race or gender, are allowed to vote. And that comes to the 26th Amendment. And once again, Congress has the power to enforce this amendment through legislation. All right, so that was a brief discussion of the various rights that are listed in the Constitution.